The storm's fury swept across the plains of Coloma, California, the day they came for Zara Nash. In the spring of 1853, with her belly just beginning to swell with child, she stood trembling on her parents' porch while the town council delivered their verdict: banishment. The pregnancy out of wedlock was scandal enough, but her refusal to name the father, a married man who had taken advantage of her innocence before abandoning her, sealed her fate in the small mining settlement. "You have until sunrise," Mayor Hollister declared, his voice carrying over the wind as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Pack your things and leave Coloma. Your kind isn't welcome here anymore." Zara clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her 20 years of life suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Her parents, standing in the doorway behind her, said nothing. Their silence was another betrayal, cutting deeper than the mayor's words. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes, and her mother dabbed at tears with a handkerchief, but neither stepped forward to defend their only daughter. "Where am I supposed to go?" Zara asked, her voice barely audible above the growing storm. "That's not our concern," Councilman Porter replied coldly. "Just be gone by first light." The men turned and left, their horses' hooves splashing through puddles as rain began to fall in earnest. Zara stood motionless, the droplets mingling with her tears until she felt her mother's hesitant touch on her shoulder. "Come inside, child. You'll catch your death." Death seemed preferable to the shame that now engulfed her. Still, Zara allowed herself to be led inside the modest home where she had grown up. The warmth from the hearth did nothing to thaw the ice in her veins. "I'll help you pack," her mother said softly, unable to look Zara in the eye. "You're not going to fight for me?" Zara asked, a final, desperate hope in her voice. Her father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have to live in this town after you're gone." The gold rush brought good fortune to Coloma, but it also brought its fair share of sin. "We can't have that tarnish on our family name." "Tarnish," Zara repeated, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "This is your grandchild, a bastard," her father spat, "born of sin and shame." Zara's mother flinched at the harshness of his words but said nothing to contradict him. "I'll pack my own things," Zara said, her voice suddenly steady. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with what dignity she could muster. She climbed the stairs to her small bedroom and began gathering her possessions, few as they were. A dress, a change of undergarments, her mother's old shawl, a small pouch of coins she'd saved from working at the general store before her condition became known. She slipped her father's hunting knife into her boot. A woman alone would need protection. When she descended the stairs an hour later, her parents were waiting. Her mother pressed a bundle into her hands. "Food," she explained, "and a letter to my cousin in Sacramento. She might take you in." Sacramento was more than 40 miles away. With no horse and in her condition, it might as well have been 1,000. "The stage won't come through until Tuesday," Zara said. Her father avoided her gaze. "Best you start walking then. There's a settlement about 15 miles east. You might find someone there willing to help you the rest of the way." 15 miles, through mountain terrain, in her condition, with a storm raging. Her parents were sending her to her death, and they all knew it. Zara took the bundle without a word. There was nothing left to say. The family Bible sat open on the table. They'd been reading scripture, likely seeking justification for abandoning their daughter. Zara resisted the urge to slam it shut as she walked past. At the door, her mother grabbed her in a sudden embrace. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But not sorry enough to stand against her husband or the town. Zara pulled away, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out into the night. The rain had intensified, and lightning split the sky as she made her way down the muddy street. A few curious faces peered from windows, watching the fallen woman's departure with a mixture of righteous satisfaction and morbid curiosity. Zara didn't look back as she left Coloma behind, the town that had been her home since her parents joined the gold rush 5 years earlier. She followed the main road east, her boots already soaked through, her skirts heavy with mud and rainwater. The baby fluttered within her, a reminder that whatever happened, she wasn't truly alone. As the lights of Coloma faded behind her, the full weight of her situation descended. She was 20 years old, pregnant, with nowhere to go and no one to help her. The man who had sweet-talked her behind the church after Sunday services had returned to his wife and children once he'd gotten what he wanted, denying any involvement when Zara's condition became apparent. She had refused to name him, not out of loyalty but because she knew it would make no difference. His position in town would protect him, while she would bear the full brunt of their sin. The storm showed no signs of abating. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than 2, Zara's legs began to tremble with fatigue. The road had become treacherous, winding uphill into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Twice she slipped and fell to her knees, the second time barely avoiding a tumble down the steep embankment to her right. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brilliant flashes, revealing dense forests and rocky outcroppings. No sign of shelter, no passing travelers, nothing but wilderness and storm. Zara began to wonder if she would die here if her parents and the town council had known exactly what they were condemning her to when they cast her out. "Not like this," she whispered to her unborn child, forcing herself to keep moving. "I won't let us die like this." Another mile, and the rain finally began to slacken. Zara's pace had slowed to a painful shuffle, each step an exercise in determination. When she rounded a bend in the road and saw the cabin, at first she thought it was a hallucination born of desperation. It sat back from the road, half hidden among the pines, a sturdy structure with a porch and chimney, from which a faint curl of smoke rose into the night sky. A dim light glowed from one window. Someone was home. Zara hesitated. A woman in her position couldn't trust just anyone. The inhabitants might be worse than the storm, but the baby kicked as if urging her forward, and she made her decision. She would rather face whatever waited in that cabin than certain death on the road. She approached cautiously, her hand slipping into her boot to touch the reassuring handle of her knife. The porch steps creaked beneath her weight. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, listening. From inside came the faint sound of a fiddle, a melancholy tune that spoke of loneliness. Gathering her courage, Zara knocked. The music stopped abruptly. Heavy footsteps approached the door, and Zara tensed, ready to flee if necessary. The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared in the gap, bearded, weathered, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What business brings a woman to my door in the middle of a storm?" he asked, his voice deep and rough with disuse. "Please," Zara said, suddenly aware of how she must appear soaked to the bone, mud-splattered, desperate. "I need shelter, just until morning. I'm trying to reach the settlement east of here." The man studied her for a long moment. His gaze dropped to her midsection, where her wet dress clung to the slight but unmistakable swell of her pregnancy. "There's no settlement east of here for 30 miles, he said finally. "Who told you different?" Zara's heart sank. Of course her father had lied. He had sent her into the wilderness with no real hope of survival. "My mistake," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please, I can pay." She reached for the small pouch of coins, but her fingers were so numb with cold that she fumbled and dropped it. Coins spilled across the porch, rolling into the cracks between the boards. To her surprise, the man made no move to grab the money. Instead, he opened the door wider. "Keep your coins," he said. "Come in before you freeze to death." Relief made Zara's knees buckle. She stumbled as she crossed the threshold, and the man caught her arm to steady her. His grip was firm but not rough, and he released her as soon as she was stable. The cabin's interior was Spartan but clean. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting flickering light over simple furnishings: a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, a narrow bed in one corner. A fiddle lay on the table where the man had set it down to answer her knock. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, closing the door against the storm. "I'll fetch a blanket." Zara moved toward the hearth, grateful for the warmth that immediately began to penetrate her sodden clothes. The man returned with a wool blanket, which he handed to her without ceremony. "Thank you," Zara said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I'm Zara Nash." The man nodded but offered no name in return. He moved to a small stove in the corner and lifted the lid on a pot that simmered there. "Stew," he said. "You should eat." Zara watched as he ladled the steaming food into a bowl and brought it to her along with a spoon and a chunk of bread. The smell made her stomach growl audibly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. "Thank you," she said again, accepting the food. She ate carefully at first, then with increasing hunger as the rich flavors of venison and root vegetables filled her mouth. The man sat in a chair opposite her, picking up his fiddle again but not playing. He simply held it, his fingers running absently over the strings. "They cast you out," he said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Zara paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth. "How did you know? Seen it before. Town finds a woman in your condition, no husband to speak of, they send her packing. Sometimes they're kind enough to arrange passage somewhere. Sometimes they just point to the road and wash their hands of her." "The latter in my case," Zara said, her appetite suddenly diminished despite her hunger. The man nodded, unsurprised. "Which town?" "Coloma." A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Gold Rush Town. Full of men who think they're struck it rich and women who know better. You know it. I passed through, didn't stay long." He set the fiddle aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. In the firelight, Zara could see him more clearly now, a man perhaps in his early 30s, with a full beard streaked with premature gray, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a permanent wariness, and broad shoulders that spoke of a life of physical labor. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt, canvas pants, boots that had seen better days. "You have family elsewhere?" he asked. Zara shook her head. "My mother suggested her cousin in Sacramento, but..." She trailed off. Even if she could make it that far, there was no guarantee her mother's cousin would be any more welcoming than her parents had been. The man grunted. "Sacramento's a long journey for a woman in your condition, especially on foot." "I'm aware," Zara said, unable to keep a trace of bitterness from her voice. "What's your plan?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "I don't have one," she admitted after a moment. "I was just trying to survive the night." He nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable approach. "Well, you've managed that much. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Zara asked, startled. The man seemed equally surprised by his choice of words. He cleared his throat. "Figure of speech. You'll need to decide your own path, of course." But something had shifted in the atmosphere between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that her predicament was now, in some small way, a shared concern. "What's your name?" Zara asked. He hesitated before answering. Reed Xavier." "You live here alone, Mr. Xavier?" "Reed," he corrected. "And yes, have for 3 years now." "What do you do out here, all alone?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Ask a lot of questions, don't you?" Zara set down her now empty bowl. "I'm alone in a cabin with a strange man miles from anywhere. Seems reasonable to want to know who I'm dealing with." Reed acknowledged this with a tilt of his head. "Fair enough. I trap hunt, do some prospecting when the season's right. Trade with passing travelers, and in the settlements when I need supplies I can't make or catch myself." He gestured toward a corner where several animal pelts hung. "It's a living. A solitary one," Zara observed. "That's the point," Reed said, and something in his tone suggested the subject was closed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the trees. The cabin, however, was solid and warm, a fortress against the elements. For the first time since the town council had appeared on her parents' porch, Zara felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "You should rest," Reed said, rising from his chair. "Take the bed, I'll sleep here by the fire." Zara hesitated. "I couldn't." "You can and you will," Reed interrupted firmly. "You're exhausted and carrying a child. The bed's not much, but it's better than the floor." Too tired to argue further, Zara nodded gratefully. She stood, still wrapped in the blanket, and moved toward the narrow bed in the corner. It was simply made with a straw mattress, but it looked clean, covered with a patchwork quilt that had seen years of use but had been carefully maintained. Reed turned his back discreetly as she removed her mud-caked boots and outer dress, slipping under the quilt in her shift. The bed smelled of pine and wood smoke, his scent, she realized. "Thank you," she said again, the words inadequate for the kindness he had shown a desperate stranger. Reed merely nodded, adding another log to the fire before settling himself in the chair, his long legs stretched toward the hearth. "Sleep," he said. "You're safe here." And strangely, despite everything, Zara believed him. As exhaustion claimed her, her last conscious thought was that perhaps there was still some goodness in the world after all. Morning came with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the cabin's small windows and the distant calls of birds. Zara awoke slowly, momentarily confused by her surroundings until the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from the long walk in the rain. Reed was already awake, moving quietly about the cabin. He had a pot of coffee brewing on the stove and was slicing bread at the table. He glanced up as she stirred. "Morning," he said. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up." Zara thanked him and made use of the basin, the cool water refreshing against her face. Her dress from the night before was still damp and muddy, but there was little she could do about that. She put it on anyway, smoothing it as best she could and running her fingers through her tangled hair. When she turned, she found Reed watching her with an unreadable expression. "What?" she asked self-consciously. He seemed to shake himself slightly. "Nothing, coffee." They sat at the table, a surprisingly comfortable silence between them as they ate a simple breakfast of bread, honey, and strong coffee. Through the window, Zara could see that the storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening in the morning light. "Your dress needs drying properly," Reed said eventually, "and those boots won't last another day of walking in that condition." Zara looked down at her pitiful footwear. The leather was cracked and separating from the soles. "They're all I have." Reed seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, "I have a proposition for you." Zara tensed. She had been in this position before a man offering help with strings attached. The father of her child had made promises too, sweet words that turned to ashes once he had taken what he wanted. Seeing her wariness, Reed raised his hands slightly. "Not that kind of proposition. I'm suggesting a practical arrangement." "What sort of arrangement?" Zara asked cautiously. "Stay here, at least until the baby comes." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if suggesting nothing more consequential than another cup of coffee. "You need shelter, food, protection. I have all three to offer." Zara stared at him, stunned. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Reed's gaze shifted to the window, to the wilderness beyond. "I've seen what happens to women cast out the way you were. Most don't survive, or if they do, it's by means no one should have to resort to." He looked back at her, his expression serious. "I'm not offering charity. You'd work for your keep cooking, mending, keeping the cabin in order while I'm out trapping, things I've neglected, living alone. And when the baby comes, that's for you to decide. You could stay on if the arrangement works for us both, or I could help you get to Sacramento or wherever you choose to go." Zara considered his offer. It was unexpected, almost too good to be true, and yet there was something about Reed Xavier that inspired trust despite her best instincts. "People would talk," she said, "if they knew a single woman was living here with you." Reed's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Who would talk? My nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and I see him maybe twice a year. I don't much care what people think, Miss Nash." Out here, survival matters more than reputation. He had a point. And what reputation did she have left to protect? She was already ruined in the eyes of society. "Why?" she asked again. "Why help me?" Reed was silent for a long moment. "This cabin has stood empty too long," he said finally, his voice quieter. "It was built for a family, for life." He gestured vaguely around the space. "These walls, they've known too much silence. Maybe they're ready for something different." There was more to it. Zara sensed some story he wasn't telling, but she didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, herself included. "All right," she said, making her decision. "I accept your proposition, Mr. Xavier." "Reed," he corrected again. "Reed," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. "I accept, and I'm a good cook in case you were wondering." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "That's fortunate, I'm not." And so began their unusual arrangement. The first few days were awkward, as they navigated the close quarters and established boundaries. Reed was gone for much of each day, checking his trapping lines or hunting in the surrounding forest. In his absence, Zara set about transforming the cabin from a mere shelter into something closer to a home. She found clay pots of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and put them to good use in the meals she prepared. She swept the rough wooden floors, washed the few dishes and utensils, and organized the supplies that had been haphazardly stacked on shelves. She even managed to wash her dress properly and hang it to dry while wearing a spare shirt of Reed's that hung to her knees. When Reed returned that evening to find the cabin clean, a savory stew simmering on the stove, and Zara wearing his shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he paused in the doorway, an expression of bewilderment on his face. "Is something wrong?" Zara asked, suddenly concerned that she had overstepped. Reed shook his head slowly. "No, it's just different. Good different or bad different?" His eyes met hers. "Good," he said simply, and set about removing his boots. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. Reed would leave at dawn and return before dusk, bringing game or fish or, occasionally, supplies from his cache further up in the mountains. Zara would tend to the cabin and prepare meals, gradually adding her own touches to the sparse interior wildflowers in a jar on the table. A new arrangement of the furniture to better use the space, small comforts crafted from what was available. They talked little at first, but as days turned to weeks, the silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. Reed, Zara discovered, was well-read despite his isolated existence. The books on his shelves weren't merely for show, they were worn from repeated reading classics, philosophy, practical guides to survival and medicine. "Where did you learn to read like this?" she asked one evening as she mended a tear in one of his shirts. Her own education had been basic at best, focused on the practical skills a woman would need to run a household. Reed was cleaning his hunting rifle by the fire, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "My father was a schoolteacher back east," he said without looking up. Believed education was the greatest gift he could give his children. It was the first personal information he had volunteered about his past. Zara proceeded cautiously. "You have siblings?" A shadow crossed his face. "Had a brother, younger." The past tense told its own story. Zara didn't push further. "My parents thought reading was frivolous for a girl," she offered instead. "Said it would give me ideas above my station. I learned anyway from the minister's wife when I helped clean the church." Reed glanced up at that. "You're smarter than they gave you credit for." "Not smart enough to avoid my current situation," Zara said, one hand moving to her growing belly. Reed set his rifle aside. "Trusting someone who betrayed that trust doesn't make you stupid, it makes him dishonorable." The simple statement, delivered matter-of-factly, brought unexpected tears to Zara's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, focusing on her mending. "Thank you for saying that." Reed nodded and returned to his task. But something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might eventually become friendship. As spring gave way to early summer, Zara's pregnancy advanced. Her body changed, the swell of her abdomen becoming more pronounced, her movements slower and more deliberate. Reed observed these changes silently, but made adjustments to accommodate her condition, bringing water from the stream so she wouldn't have to make the trip, building a more comfortable chair for her to use, returning from his trips with wild berries or honey, small luxuries to supplement their diet. One warm afternoon in June, as Zara sat on the porch shelling peas, she felt the baby kick with particular vigor. She gasped, her hand going to the spot. Reed, who was skinning a rabbit nearby, looked up sharply. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Zara assured him, smiling. "The baby is active today." She hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to feel?" Reed froze, knife in hand, an expression of alarm crossing his face. "I don't know if that's appropriate." Zara almost laughed at his discomfort. This man who faced the wilderness daily, who could track a wounded deer for miles or face down a mountain lion, as he had once, according to a story he'd reluctantly shared, was undone by the prospect of feeling a baby kick. "It's perfectly appropriate," she said gently. "Come here." After a moment's hesitation, Reed set down his knife and wiped his hands on a cloth. He approached cautiously, as if she might change her mind. Zara took his hand calloused, strong, capable, and placed it on the curve of her belly. For a moment nothing happened and Reed stood awkwardly, his hand resting lightly on her. Then the baby kicked again, a strong movement against his palm. Reed's eyes widened in wonder. He stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. A miracle, Zara finished for him. Reed nodded, his hand still on her belly, his expression transforming from wonder to something else, a deep, profound sadness that vanished so quickly Zara might have imagined it. A miracle, he agreed quietly and withdrew his hand. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Reed broke their usual companionable silence. "This cabin," he said, staring into the flames, "was meant for a family." Zara set aside the shirt she was mending. "You mentioned that before." Reed nodded. "I built it for my wife, Margaret." The name seemed to catch in his throat. "She was carrying our child when the fever took her, 3 years ago now." The revelation struck Zara like a physical blow. Suddenly, so many things made sense: his willingness to help her, his knowledge of pregnancy, the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. "Reed, I'm so sorry," she said softly. He continued as if he hadn't heard her, the words pouring out after years of silence. "We came west during the rush like everyone else. Not for gold, though, for land, for a fresh start. Found this valley, thought it was perfect, built this place with my own hands while she planted a garden." He gestured toward the window where the remains of that garden could still be seen, now overgrown with wildflowers. "She never got to see it bloom. And the baby," Zara asked gently, "died with her." Reed's voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "I buried them together up on the ridge where the sunrise hits first. She always liked the morning best." Zara didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate in the face of such loss. "I should have left," Reed continued. "Burned this place to the ground and never looked back. That would have been the sensible thing to do." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "But I couldn't. This cabin, it was the last thing I built for her, for our child. Leaving felt like abandoning them all over again." "So you stayed," Zara said, understanding dawning. "Alone." Reed nodded. "Until you knocked on my door in the middle of a storm." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Zara understood now why he had offered her shelter, why the sight of a pregnant woman alone and desperate had moved him to action. She represented everything he had lost a chance to make right what had gone so terribly wrong in his own life. "I'm not her," Zara said quietly. "I can't replace what you lost." "I know that," Reed replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I've never thought of you as a replacement. You're something else entirely." "What am I, then?" Reed considered the question, his gaze moving from the fire to her face. "A second chance," he said finally. "Not for me, for this place, this cabin. It calls for a mother's touch, it always has." His words wrapped around Zara's heart like a warm blanket. For months, she had been defined by her mistakes, by the scandal of her pregnancy and the judgment of others. But here, in this cabin in the wilderness with this solitary, wounded man, she wasn't a fallen woman or a cautionary tale. She was simply Zara, bringing life back to a place that had known too much death. "This cabin calls you mother," Reed said, so softly she almost didn't hear him. "And watching you these past weeks, I've begun to think it was right to call you here." Zara felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of recognition, of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Reed nodded once, then stood abruptly. "It's late. You should rest." The moment had passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. As Zara climbed into the bed that night, she felt the baby move within her and placed her hand on her rounded belly. "We might be all right after all," she whispered to her unborn child. "We just might be." The summer progressed, hot days giving way to cooler evenings as July turned to August. Zara's pregnancy entered its final stages, her body growing heavier and more unwieldy with each passing day. Reed spent less time on his trapping lines and more time close to the cabin, though he never explicitly said it was out of concern for her. One afternoon, he returned from a trip to a trading post 20 miles away with unexpected treasures, fabric for baby clothes. A small wooden cradle he had traded 4 beaver pelts to acquire, and most surprising of all, a book of children's stories. For when the little one is older, he explained awkwardly, setting the items on the table. Zara ran her fingers over the cradle, beautifully crafted with intricate carvings along the sides. Reed, this is too much, he shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Baby needs somewhere to sleep. Zara smiled at his matter-of-fact tone. Over the months, she had come to understand that Reed Xavier expressed his feelings through actions rather than words. The cradle spoke volumes about his growing investment in her child's well-being. Using the fabric he had brought, Zara began sewing simple garments for the baby's swaddling cloths, tiny shirts, a soft blanket. Reed watched her work in the evenings, occasionally offering suggestions based on half-remembered conversations with his late wife about what a baby might need. "Have you thought about names?" he asked one night as Zara stitched by the light of the oil lamp. She looked up, surprised by the question. "A few, nothing certain yet. Boy or girl?" Zara smiled, her hand resting on her belly. "I don't know. Sometimes I think one, sometimes the other." Reed nodded thoughtfully. Margaret liked the name Samuel for a boy after her father. It was the closest he had come to suggesting any involvement in naming her child. Zara considered the offering carefully. "Samuel is a good name," she said. "Strong, and for a girl." Reed hesitated. She favored Elizabeth, but that was her choice, not mine to give away. "What would you choose?" Zara asked softly. Reed seemed caught off guard by the question. "Me," he frowned, considering. "I always thought Grace was a fine name for a girl, simple but meaningful." "Grace," Zara repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that. Grace if it's a girl, Samuel if it's a boy." Reed's expression softened, and for a moment Zara caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if tragedy hadn't reshaped him younger somehow, unburdened by grief. "They're good names," he said, and returned to the book he was reading, but Zara noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page. As August waned, Zara's time drew near. Her back ached constantly and sleep became elusive, the baby's movements keeping her awake through the night. Reed insisted she take the bed exclusively now, making a pallet for himself by the fire despite her protests. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, when Zara felt the first pain, a sharp contraction that made her gasp and clutch the arm of her chair. Reed was immediately alert. "What is it?" "I think," Zara began, but another contraction cut off her words. "The baby," she managed. "It's coming." Reed's face paled visibly, but his voice remained steady. "How sure are you? First babies often give false alarms." "Very sure," Zara said through gritted teeth as another wave of pain washed over her. Reed nodded once, decisively, and helped her to her feet. "Let's get you inside." The next 12 hours were a blur of pain and fear for Zara. The contractions came in increasingly brutal waves, each one threatening to tear her apart from the inside. Reed moved with surprising efficiency, boiling water, preparing clean cloths, arranging the bed to better support her. "You seem to know what you're doing," Zara gasped between contractions. "I delivered foals and calves growing up," Reed said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the worry etched on his face. "The principle is similar, though I'd rather have a midwife here." "Well, it's just us," Zara said, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace as another contraction seized her. As the night wore on, Reed remained at her side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, encouraging her with a quiet steadiness that became her anchor in a sea of pain. When dawn broke and Zara's strength was nearly gone, he took her hands in his. "You can do this," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Zara Nash. Your child is lucky to have you for a mother." His words gave her a final surge of determination. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, Zara gave one last push and the cabin filled with the indignant wail of a newborn. "A boy," Reed announced, his voice thick with emotion as he quickly wrapped the squalling infant in a clean cloth. "You have a son, Zara." Tears streamed down Zara's face as Reed placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, his head covered in dark wisps of hair, his tiny fists balled in protest at his abrupt entry into the world. He was the most beautiful thing Zara had ever seen. "Samuel," she whispered, touching his cheek with a trembling finger. "Hello, my sweet Samuel." Reed watched them, his expression unguarded in a way Zara had never seen before, a complex mixture of joy, wonder, and lingering sadness. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "I couldn't have done this without you." Reed shook his head. "You did all the work, I just caught him at the end." But they both knew it was more than that. In the months since that stormy night when Zara had appeared on his doorstep, Reed had become her protector, her provider, her friend. And now, in some indefinable way, he had become something to her son as well, not a father, exactly, but not a stranger either. As Zara gazed down at Samuel, exhausted but exhilarated, she realized with sudden clarity that the cabin had indeed called her mother, and she had answered. The first weeks after Samuel's birth were a blur of exhaustion and joy for Zara. The baby seemed to require constant attention, waking at all hours for feeding, changing, or simply to be held. Reed proved an unexpected source of support, rising in the night to bring the crying infant to Zara for nursing, then walking the floor with him afterward so she could get some rest. "You're good with him," Zara observed one morning as Reed cradled Samuel against his chest, the baby's tiny fingers curled around one of Reed's large, calloused ones. Reed looked almost embarrassed by the observation. "He's an easy baby," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Samuel had a healthy set of lungs and wasn't shy about using them. As autumn approached, bringing cooler nights and the first hints of color to the trees, Zara found herself settling more deeply into life at the cabin. What had begun as a temporary shelter had become something like a home. She and Reed had fallen into domestic rhythms that felt almost like a marriage, though neither of them acknowledged this aloud. Reed expanded his trapping territory, bringing in more pelts to trade for the supplies they would need for winter. Zara preserved food, drying berries, smoking meat, canning the vegetables she had coaxed from the resurrected garden. They worked together to repair the cabin's roof and chink its walls against the coming cold, and through it all, Samuel grew, his presence filling the once silent cabin with new life. His first smile directed at Reed, as the man whittled by the fire brought an answering grin to Reed's face that transformed his features completely. His first laugh, triggered by Zara's song as she rocked him, seemed to chase the last lingering shadows from the corners of the cabin. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel sleeping peacefully in the cradle Reed had brought out, Zara found herself wondering about the future. Winter was coming, and after that, spring. What then? Would Reed expect them to move on once the weather improved? The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. "What are you thinking about?" Reed asked, noticing her pensive expression. Zara hesitated, then decided on honesty. "The future. What happens when winter ends?" Reed was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "What do you want to happen?" It was the question Zara had been asking herself for weeks. The practical answer would be to move on, to find a town where she could make a respectable life for herself and Samuel. Perhaps Sacramento, as her mother had suggested all those months ago. But the thought of leaving the cabin, leaving Reed, felt increasingly like the wrong choice. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "When I first came here, I thought this would be temporary, a safe place until Samuel was born, nothing more." She glanced at the sleeping baby, then back at Reed. "But now—" "Now," Reed prompted when she trailed off. Zara took a deep breath. "Now I find myself thinking of this place as home, of us as—" She stopped, uncertain how to define what they had become to each other. Reed's expression gave nothing away. "As what?" "As a family," Zara said softly. "Not in the conventional sense, perhaps, but in all the ways that matter." Reed stood abruptly and moved to the edge of the porch, his back to her. For a terrible moment, Zara thought she had misread everything, that her words had offended him somehow. "I'm sorry," she began. "I didn't mean to presume, don't apologize," Reed interrupted, turning to face her. The fading sunlight caught the sheen of moisture in his eyes. "You haven't presumed anything I haven't thought myself." Hope fluttered in Zara's chest. "Then you feel it too." Reed ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I built this cabin for a family," he said, "for laughter and tears and all the messy business of living. When I lost Margaret and our child, I thought that dream died with them." He glanced at Samuel, then met Zara's gaze directly. "You and the boy have proven me wrong. This cabin has come alive again, because of you." Zara stood and moved to join him, Samuel still sleeping soundly in his cradle. "What are you saying, Reed?" "I'm saying I want you to stay," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you, not just through winter, but beyond, permanently." Zara's heart raced. "As what, your housekeeper?" Reed shook his head. "As my wife, if you'll have me." The proposal, delivered with Reed's characteristic directness, took Zara's breath away. "Your wife, but we're not. We haven't, I know," Reed said. "I'm not asking out of passion, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't find you beautiful." A flush crept up his neck at this admission. "I'm asking because in these months together, I've come to respect you, to admire your courage and your strength. I'm asking because Samuel deserves a father, and I'd be honored to be that to him. I'm asking because I believe we could build a good life together, a happy life." It wasn't a declaration of undying love. It was something more solid, more enduring, an offer of partnership, of shared purpose, of mutual respect. In many ways, it was better than the pretty words and empty promises Zara had once believed. "You don't have to answer now," Reed added quickly. "Take time to think." "Yes," Zara interrupted. "My answer is yes." Reed blinked, surprised by her certainty. "Are you sure? I'm not an easy man, Zara. I've lived alone too long, and I carry shadows that may never fully lift." "I have shadows of my own," Zara replied. "And a child born of another man's broken promises. Neither of us comes to this unblemished, Reed. But perhaps that's what makes us right for each other. We see each other clearly, scars and all." Reed nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then it's settled." "It's settled," Zara agreed. Reed hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. His touch was gentle, tentative, as if he feared she might pull away. Zara interlaced her fingers with his, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. From his cradle, Samuel gave a small cry, waking from his nap. Reed released Zara's hand so she could tend to the baby, but his eyes followed her movements with a new warmth, a new certainty. "We should be married before winter sets in," he said as Zara lifted Samuel to her shoulder, patting his back soothingly. "There's a preacher who comes through the valley every few months. He's due soon if the pattern holds." Zara nodded, her cheek pressed against Samuel's downy head. "That would be perfect." As if on cue, Samuel gave a contented sigh and settled back into sleep, one tiny hand clutching the fabric of Zara's dress. Reed's expression as he watched them was one of quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe this turn his life had taken. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked softly. Reed considered the question. "I'm thinking that sometimes life takes everything from you," he said finally, "and sometimes, when you least expect it, it gives everything back different but no less precious." It was perhaps the most poetic thing Zara had ever heard him say. She smiled, understanding the gift of his open heart, the rarity of his unguarded words. "I think you're right," she replied simply, "and I'm grateful." The preacher arrived 2 weeks later, his circuit bringing him through the valley just as Reed had predicted. He was a weathered old man named Reverend Thomas, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Zara somewhat of Reed himself. "Marriage, eh?" he said when Reed explained the situation. "Been a while since I performed one of those out this way." His shrewd gaze moved from Reed to Zara, then to Samuel in her arms. If he had any thoughts about the baby's presence, he kept them to himself. "Tomorrow at noon, then. Give me time to rest these old bones before continuing on." They were married the next day in front of the cabin, with only the mountains and trees as witnesses. Zara wore her one good dress, freshly washed and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair. Reed had shaved his beard to a neat trim and put on a clean shirt. Samuel, wrapped in the blanket Zara had made for him, slept peacefully in his cradle throughout the brief ceremony. The vows were simple, traditional promises to love, honor, and cherish until death parted them. As Zara repeated the ancient words, she felt their weight, their meaning. This wasn't the romance she had dreamed of as a girl, but it was something deeper, more enduring. A choice made with clear eyes and full understanding of what they were building together. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Reed took Zara's face gently between his hands and kissed her their first kiss, sweet and tentative, a beginning rather than a culmination. "Mrs. Xavier," he murmured as he pulled away, testing the sound of her new name. Zara smiled, her heart full. "Mr. Xavier," she replied, and they both laughed, the sound echoing off the mountains, carried away by the crisp autumn breeze. Reverend Thomas stayed for a meal, sharing stories of his travels and the people he ministered to across the vast territory. Before he left, he baptized Samuel, officially recording his name as Samuel Reed Xavier in his traveling register. "A good name," he said approvingly, handing the baby back to Zara. "Strong, biblical, he'll grow into it well," he nodded to Reed. "You've got yourself a fine family here, son." "Treasure them?" "I intend to," Reed replied solemnly. After the preacher departed, continuing his circuit to the next settlement, Reed and Zara stood together on the porch, watching him disappear down the trail. Samuel was awake now, his dark eyes taking in the world with solemn curiosity. "Well," Reed said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "That's done." Zara glanced at him, amused by his awkwardness. "Having second thoughts already, husband?" The word made Reed's expression soften. "No," he said firmly. "No second thoughts, just adjusting to the idea. It's been a long time since I thought of myself as part of a family." Zara shifted Samuel to one arm and took Reed's hand with her free one. "We have time," she said. "All the time we need to figure this out together." That night, as Samuel slept in his cradle beside their bed, Reed and Zara consummated their marriage with tender, hesitant touches that grew more confident as they discovered each other. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Reed's arm around her waist and his steady breathing in her ear, Zara felt a sense of peace she had thought lost to her forever. This cabin, once a place of grief and solitude, had indeed called her mother, and now it had made her wife as well. The thought brought a smile to her lips as she drifted into sleep, secure in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world at last. Winter descended on the valley with a vengeance, bringing heavy snows that transformed the landscape into a white wilderness. The cabin, nestled among the pines, stood as a warm sanctuary against the elements. Inside, the newly formed Xavier family adapted to their first season together. Reed proved himself a devoted husband and a patient, if sometimes awkward, father figure to Samuel. He crafted toys for the baby, a rattle made from smooth wood, a stuffed bear sewn from scraps of fur, a mobile of carved animals that hung above the cradle. In the evenings, he would hold Samuel on his lap by the fire, his deep voice rumbling through children's stories, or simply talking about the day's events as if the infant could understand every word. Zara watched these interactions with a full heart, amazed at how naturally Reed had taken to fatherhood despite his initial reservations. Her own adjustment to marriage was equally smooth. Reed was considerate, gentle, never demanding more than she was ready to give. Their physical relationship deepened as winter progressed, passion growing alongside the affection and respect that had formed the foundation of their union. Christmas arrived with a heavy snowfall that kept them cabin-bound for 3 days. Reed surprised Zara with gifts he had been hiding for weeks, a silver hair comb he had traded for in autumn, a new woolen shawl he had commissioned from a woman in the nearest settlement, a small wooden box with a delicate carving of a mother and child on the lid. "It's beautiful," Zara said, tracing the carving with her finger. "Did you make this?" Reed nodded, looking pleased at her reaction. "Been working on it when you were asleep. Not as fine as I'd like, but—" "It's perfect," Zara insisted. She had gifts for him too, a new shirt she had sewn secretly, a book of poetry she had found among his collection and rebound with a new leather cover, and a portrait she had drawn of Samuel, using charcoal on a smooth piece of birch bark. The latter gift moved Reed deeply. He stared at the simple drawing for a long moment, his throat working visibly before he could speak. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "This means more than I can say. For Samuel, they had filled a stocking with small, soft toys and hung it by the fire. Though the baby was too young to understand the significance of the day, they celebrated as a family, creating traditions they would carry forward into future years. January brought the deepest cold and the brightest stars. On clear nights, Reed would bundle Zara and Samuel in furs and take them outside to see the spectacular display overhead, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the black velvet sky. "I used to think the stars were cold," Reed said one such night, his arm around Zara's shoulders as they stood in the snow, Samuel sleeping against her chest. "Beautiful but distant, uncaring." "And now?" Zara asked, tilting her face up to look at him. Reed's gaze moved from the stars to her face, his expression softening in the way it did only for her. "Now I think they're like tiny hearth fires, each one a home, a center for someone, just as we are to each other." The poetry of his words surprised Zara, as it always did when Reed revealed the depth of thought beneath his taciturn exterior. She leaned into him, savoring his warmth against the winter chill. "I love you," she said simply. It was the first time she had spoken the words aloud, though she had felt them growing inside her for months. Reed's arm tightened around her. "And I love you," he replied, the declaration as straightforward and honest as the man himself. "You and Samuel both, more than I thought possible." They sealed the words with a kiss. There, beneath the winter stars, with their son sleeping peacefully between them, a family forged not by blood or convention, but by choice and circumstance, and the quiet courage to begin again. February brought illness, a fever that swept through the valley, carried by a trapper who had stopped at the cabin for a night's shelter on his way north. Reed fell ill first, his usually robust constitution ravaged by the sickness. For 3 terrifying days he burned with fever, muttering incoherently, his powerful frame reduced to trembling weakness. Zara nursed him desperately, applying cool cloths to his forehead, forcing broth between his cracked lips, praying with a fervor she hadn't felt since childhood. The specter of Margaret's death from fever hung over the cabin like a dark cloud, a reminder that medicine was scarce and doctors non-existent in this remote wilderness. On the 3rd night, as Reed's fever reached its crisis point, Zara sat beside their bed, Samuel asleep in her lap, and made a silent plea to whatever forces might be listening. "Not again," she whispered, taking Reed's burning hand in hers. "Don't take him from us, please." Whether it was her care, Reed's natural strength, or divine intervention, the fever broke before dawn. Zara woke from an exhausted doze to find Reed watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice weak but lucid. "Where else would I be?" Zara replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. Reed's recovery was slow but steady. By March, he was back to his full strength, though the illness had left him with a new appreciation for life's fragility. He spoke more openly of his feelings, held Samuel more often, touched Zara with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. As winter loosened its grip on the valley, and the first signs of spring appeared, snowdrops pushing through melting drifts, the return of birdsong to the warming air, Zara made a discovery of her own. She was pregnant again. She shared the news with Reed on a mild April morning as they worked together in the revitalized garden, planting seeds for the summer harvest. "Are you certain?" he asked, his hands stilling in the dark earth. Zara nodded. "Fairly certain. The signs are all there, the same as with Samuel." Reed sat back on his heels, his expression a complex mixture of joy and concern. "How do you feel about it? This wasn't planned." Zara placed her hand on her still flat stomach. "Happy," she said honestly. "Nervous, of course, but happy. Samuel will have a brother or sister, our child, our child." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. This baby would be different from Samuel, conceived in love, born to parents who were committed to each other, who had chosen each other with clear eyes and full hearts. Reed moved to kneel beside her, placing his hand over hers on her abdomen. "Our child," he repeated softly. "I never thought I'd have this chance again. Are you happy about it?" Zara asked, suddenly uncertain. Reed's answer was to pull her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "More than I can say," he murmured against her hair. "More than I deserve." "You deserve every happiness," Zara said fiercely, pulling back to look into his eyes. "After everything you've lost, everything you've given us." Reed shook his head slightly. "You have it backwards, Zara. You and Samuel gave me back my life when I was just going through the motions. This baby is a gift I never expected." They finished planting the garden with renewed purpose, now growing food not just for themselves, but for the expanding family they were becoming. As Reed worked, he spoke softly to Zara about plans for the future, expanding the cabin to add another room, building a proper barn for the milk cow he intended to acquire, perhaps even establishing a small orchard on the sunny slope behind the cabin. "We could make something here," he said, his vision expanding beyond mere survival to true settlement. "Something lasting." Zara watched him, this man who had rescued her on a stormy night and slowly, steadily become the center of her world. "We already have," she replied. Summer came, bringing long golden days and star-filled nights. Samuel took his first steps across the cabin floor, stumbling into Reed's waiting arms with a triumphant laugh. Zara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body rounding with the new life within. The garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for their table and extra to preserve for winter. In July, Reed made a week-long journey to the largest settlement in the territory, returning with supplies, news, and unexpected treasures: fabric for baby clothes, a second cradle he had commissioned from a carpenter, and most surprisingly, papers declaring his formal claim to the land surrounding their cabin. 160 acres, he told Zara as they examined the documents together. From the ridge to the stream and half a mile in either direction, officially recognized by territorial authorities. "You've claimed the land," Zara said, understanding the significance, "made it legal." Reed nodded. "For all of us, for the future." He hesitated, then added, "I've registered Samuel as my legal son, if that's acceptable to you." Zara's eyes filled with tears. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler playing at their feet, looked up at the sound of his name. "Of course it's acceptable. It's what he is in every way that matters." Reed smiled, reaching down to ruffle the boy's dark hair. "Xavier land," he said. "Xavier family." The words settled over Zara like a warm blanket. After years of uncertainty, of judgment and rejection, she had found not just shelter but belonging. A place, a name, a future. The baby arrived in late September as the aspens on the mountainsides turned golden in the autumn light. The labor was shorter than with Samuel, but no less intense. Reed stayed by Zara's side throughout, supporting her with the same steady presence that had become her constant comfort. When their daughter slipped into the world with a lusty cry, Reed caught her with practiced hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Grace," Zara said as he placed the tiny girl in her arms. "Grace Margaret Xavier." Reed's breath caught at the middle name, his eyes meeting Zara's in silent gratitude for honoring the woman who had come before. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's perfect." And she was tiny and red-faced and indignant, with a dusting of copper hair that caught the lamplight like spun gold. Samuel, allowed into the room once things were cleaned up, regarded his new sister with solemn curiosity. "Baby," he said, one of the few words in his developing vocabulary. "Baby Grace." "That's right," Zara told him, making room for him to climb onto the bed beside her. "Your sister, you'll help look after her, won't you?" Samuel nodded seriously, reaching out one chubby finger to touch Grace's tiny hand. The baby reflexively grasped his finger, and Samuel's eyes widened in delight. Reed watched his family from the foot of the bed, his expression one of wonder and profound gratitude. In that moment, Zara knew with bone-deep certainty that they had built something rare and precious, a home where love flourished despite the harshness of the frontier. A family bound by choice rather than mere blood. Winter came again, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of short days and long nights. But this year was different, the cabin warmer somehow, filled with Samuel's toddling adventures and Grace's infant needs, with Reed's deep laughter and Zara's songs. What had once been a place of solitary grief had become a haven of shared joy on Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the children asleep in their beds. Reed and Zara sat before the fire, a rare moment of quiet between them. Reed poured a small measure of whiskey for each of them, a luxury he had been saving for a special occasion. "To the year past," he said, raising his glass, "and the years to come." Zara touched her glass to his. "To family," she replied, "to home." They drank, the liquor warming Zara from the inside. Reed set his glass aside and took her hand, his expression growing serious. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "Something I should have said long ago." Zara's heart quickened. "What is it?" "That night when you came to my door in the storm, I almost didn't answer." Zara had suspected as much but had never asked. "What changed your mind?" Reed's gaze moved to the window where the falling snow was visible in the lamplight. "I heard a voice," he said quietly. Clear as day, though there was no one there, it said, "Open the door, Reed. She needs you." He looked back at Zara, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I thought I was imagining things, but the voice came again, and this time it said, 'This cabin calls her mother.'" A shiver ran through Zara. "Margaret's voice?" Reed shook his head slowly. "I don't know, maybe, or maybe just my own conscience telling me what I already knew, that this place was built for more than my grief, that it needed life to make it whole again." He squeezed her hand. "Either way, I'm grateful. For whatever made me open that door, for whatever brought you to it." "As am I," Zara said softly. Reed pulled her gently into his arms, and they sat together before the fire, listening to the wind in the pines and the soft breathing of their children in the next room. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their homestead in pristine white, while inside, the cabin that had once known only sorrow embraced the family it had called home. Spring came early the following year, bringing with it Zara's 22nd birthday and plans for expansion. Reed had been working through the winter on designs for additional rooms to accommodate their growing family and the future they now dared to imagine stretching out before them. "We could add a proper kitchen here," he explained one evening, showing Zara the rough sketches he had made. "And another bedroom on the other side, maybe even a small schoolroom eventually for the children's education." Zara smiled, watching Grace crawl determinedly across the cabin floor while Samuel helped by encouraging his sister with enthusiastic clapping. "Are you planning on more children, Mr. Xavier?" Reed's ears reddened slightly, but his gaze was steady. "I wouldn't object, if you were willing." The idea of more children, brothers and sisters for Samuel and Grace, the Xavier name continuing into future generations, filled Zara with quiet joy. How far she had come from that desperate night when she had been cast out, alone and afraid. Now she was surrounded by love, by possibility, by a future brighter than any she could have imagined. "I think," she said, leaning against Reed's solid shoulder, "this cabin could call a few more children home." Reed's arm circled her waist, pulling her close. "Then we'd better start building, Mrs. Xavier. We have a dynasty to establish." Zara laughed, turning her face up to his. "A dynasty." "In this wilderness?" Reed's expression grew serious despite his smile. "Why not? The West is being made by families just like ours, people who weren't wanted where they came from, who found each other against all odds, who built something new out of nothing but courage and determination." As if to emphasize his point, Samuel toddled over and wrapped his arms around Reed's leg, looking up with a grin that revealed his first teeth. Reed scooped him up, settling the boy on his hip with practiced ease. "Papa," Samuel said clearly, one of his newest words. "Papa build." "That's right, son," Reed agreed, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "Papa's going to build, and you'll help, won't you?" Samuel nodded enthusiastically, though he likely had little concept of what he was agreeing to. Grace, not to be left out, crawled to Zara's feet and pulled herself up, balancing precariously against her mother's skirts. "Look," Zara said softly, "she's trying to stand." They watched as Grace wobbled on uncertain legs, her small face scrunched in concentration. For a moment she balanced independently, a tiny triumph that brought a burst of pride to Zara's heart. Then she plopped down on her well-padded bottom with a surprised expression that made them all laugh. "She'll be running before we know it," Reed predicted, pride evident in his voice. Takes after her mother determined. Zara bent to pick up Grace, settling the baby on her hip in a mirror of Reed's posture with Samuel. The four of them stood together in the center of the cabin, the place that had first been built with love, then known grief, and now embraced new life with open arms. "I'd like to go into town," Zara said suddenly. "To Coloma." Reed looked at her in surprise. "Coloma, are you sure?" Zara nodded. "It's been nearly 2 years. I'm not the same woman they banished. I'm not ashamed anymore, and I want them to see that, to see what I've built, what we've built together." Reed's expression turned protective. "They treated you cruelly, Zara. They don't deserve to know the woman you've become." "It's not for them," Zara explained. "It's for me. To close that chapter completely." She hesitated, then added, "And for Samuel, someday he'll ask about his birth, about why we live so far from others. I want to be able to tell him that I faced those who judged me and showed them I survived, thrived, even despite their condemnation." Reed considered this, his gaze moving from Zara to Samuel to Grace, taking in his family with thoughtful eyes. "All right," he said finally. "When the addition to the cabin is complete and the spring planting is done, we'll go together as a family." The journey to Coloma took 3 days on horseback, with Samuel riding before Reed and Grace securely bundled against Zara's chest. The gold rush that had once made the town prosperous had slowed, but Coloma remained a significant settlement in the territory, with proper streets and established businesses replacing the hasty constructions of its early days. As they rode down the main street, Zara felt a complex swirl of emotions: anxiety, certainly, but also a strange sense of power. She was returning not as the shamed girl who had been driven out in a storm, but as a woman of substance, a wife, a mother, secure in her place in the world. People stared as they passed. A handsome family on good horses was always worth noting, but there was more to their attention than that. Zara saw recognition dawn on several faces, followed by disbelief and, in some cases, discomfort. "That's Zara Nash," she heard someone whisper. "Didn't think we'd see her back here." "It's Xavier now," Reed said clearly, having heard the comment as well. "Mrs. Zara Xavier." They stopped at the general store where Zara had once worked before her disgrace. The proprietor, Mr. Simmons, did a double take when she entered, Grace in her arms and Samuel holding Reed's hand. "Miss Nash," he said, recovering quickly, "this is a surprise." "Mrs. Xavier," Zara corrected gently. "It's good to see you, Mr. Simmons. We've come to purchase supplies." The next hour passed in a blur of careful civility as they selected what they needed: coffee, sugar, fabric, ammunition, tools. Word of their presence spread quickly through the small town, and by the time they emerged from the store, a small crowd had gathered, including several members of the town council that had banished Zara. Mayor Hollister stepped forward, his expression guarded. Mrs. "Xavier," he corrected himself, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" Zara asked, shifting Grace to her other hip. "People do tend to return to the places that shaped them, for better or worse." The mayor's gaze moved to Samuel, who was clinging to Reed's leg, uncertain in the presence of so many strangers. "Your child has grown well." "Children," Reed corrected, placing a protective hand on Samuel's head. "Our son Samuel and our daughter Grace." A murmur went through the crowd at this, the knowledge that Zara had not only survived but prospered, had found a husband, had expanded her family. The mayor shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Well," he said finally, "it seems things have worked out for the best." The bland platitude, offered as if the town had done Zara a favor by casting her out, ignited a quiet fury in her chest. She handed Grace to Reed and stepped forward, her head high. "Let's be clear, Mayor Hollister," she said, her voice carrying to the assembled onlookers. "Things have worked out because of my own strength and the kindness of the good man who became my husband, not because of anything this town did for me." She swept her gaze over the familiar faces, some ashamed, others defiant. "You sent me into the wilderness to die, me and my unborn child. That I found shelter instead of death, love instead of continued rejection, is no credit to Coloma or its people." A hush fell over the crowd. From the corner of her eye, Zara saw her parents pushing through to the front, their faces pale with shock. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth at the sight of Samuel, the grandson she had never met. "Zara," her father began, his voice uncertain, "we didn't know that I might survive, that I might find happiness." Zara's voice remained steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "You didn't care to know. You chose your reputation over your daughter and grandchild." Her mother stepped forward hesitantly. Is that our grandson?" Zara felt Reed move to stand beside her, a solid presence offering support without interference. This was her battle to fight, her peace to make or not. "This is Samuel Reed Xavier," she said, placing her hand on her son's head, "and this is Grace Margaret Xavier, my children, my family." The emphasis was clear. These children belonged to her and Reed, not to the people who had abandoned her in her time of greatest need. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Zara, if we had known, you did know," Zara interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "You knew I was your daughter, carrying your grandchild, and you chose to send me away rather than stand against the town's judgment." She took a deep breath, centering herself. "I didn't come here for recriminations or to reopen old wounds. I came to close this chapter of my life, to show my children where their mother came from, and to remind myself of how far I've traveled." Reed placed his free arm around her shoulders, Grace balanced securely on his other arm. "My wife is being more generous than many would be in her position," he said, his deep voice carrying easily. "We've built a good life 40 miles east of here, a home, a farm, a future. We need nothing from Coloma except the supplies we've purchased." The mayor cleared his throat. "Of course." "You're welcome to stay, we'll be moving on," Reed interrupted. "We have a long journey home." The word home hung in the air, a reminder of what Coloma had ceased to be for Zara. She looked at her parents one last time, noting the gray in her father's hair, the new lines around her mother's eyes. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the love she had once taken for granted. "If you ever wish to know your grandchildren," she said quietly, "you know where to find us. The Xavier homestead, east of the ridge. You would be received with civility, if not immediately with warmth." It was as much as she could offer, a door not fully closed, though not wide open either. Her mother nodded, understanding the conditional nature of the invitation. Her father looked away, pride still warring with regret on his weathered face. As they mounted their horses to leave, Samuel secure before Reed and Grace once again bundled against Zara's chest, a woman detached herself from the crowd and hurried forward. It was Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife who had taught Zara to read all those years ago. "Zara," she said, reaching up to press something into Zara's hand. "I always believed in you, child. I'm glad to see you found your way." Zara looked down at the small object, a silver thimble, simple but finely made. Mrs. Peterson had used it during their sewing lessons, praising Zara's neat stitches when few others had anything positive to say about her. "Thank you," Zara said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "For everything, Mrs. Peterson nodded, stepping back as Reed gave the signal for their horses to move forward. As they rode out of Coloma, Zara felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not forgiveness exactly, but release. The town and its judgment no longer had power over her. She had built something stronger than their condemnation, more enduring than their narrow morality. That night, camped beside a stream with the children sleeping peacefully nearby, Zara told Reed about the silver thimble and what it represented, the one person in Coloma who had seen her potential rather than her limitations. "I'll make a special place for it at home," she said. "A reminder that even in the darkest times there are those who believe in us." Reed nodded, adding another log to their campfire. "Was it difficult going back?" Zara considered the question. "Yes and no. It was harder than I expected to see my parents, to remember how completely they failed me when I needed them most." She looked at Samuel and Grace, sleeping peacefully under the stars. "But it was also empowering to show everyone that their rejection didn't destroy me. That I found a better life than anything Coloma could have offered." Reed was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the dancing flames. "You could have had a comfortable life there," he said finally. If things had been different, if they had supported you instead of casting you out. The town is prosperous, civilized. Our homestead is neither, not yet. Zara moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. Reed Xavier, are you suggesting I would have been better off without you? He shrugged, a gesture of uncertainty rather than indifference. Sometimes I wonder if you ever regretted the hardship, the isolation, being tied to a man who spent years alone in the wilderness with his grief. Never, Zara said firmly, turning his face toward hers. Not for a single moment. Coloma offered me conditional acceptance based on rigid rules and narrow minds. You offered me unconditional shelter when I needed it most, and then love without reservation. She smiled, squeezing his hand. Besides, I like a challenge. Building something from nothing, watching it grow day by day, there's joy in that kind of work. Reed's expression softened, the doubt in his eyes replaced by the warm certainty that had become familiar over their time together. There is indeed, he agreed. And speaking of building, I've been thinking about that schoolroom addition. Perhaps we should make it larger. Zara raised an eyebrow. Expecting a sudden influx of students, Reed's mouth quirked in the half-smile she had grown to love. Perhaps, eventually, if you're amenable. To more children, Zara laughed softly. I might be persuaded, Mr. Xavier. He pulled her close, his arm warm and secure around her shoulders. I love you, Zara Xavier, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, she replied simply, more than words can express. They sat together by the fire, watching over their sleeping children, the future stretching before them like the vast wilderness around them, challenging, perhaps, but full of possibility, of promise, of life waiting to be lived. The journey home took them past the spot where Zara had first seen Reed's cabin on that stormy night 2 years earlier. The road had been improved since then, but the bend where the cabin came into view remained the same. Zara reined in her horse for a moment, gazing at the familiar sight, the sturdy structure with its stone chimney, the newly cleared fields surrounding it, the garden already showing the first green shoots of spring planting. What is it? Reed asked, stopping beside her. Zara smiled, contentment washing through her. Just remembering the first time I saw it, how desperate I was, how afraid. Reed followed her gaze to their home. And now it's the place I love most in the world, she replied simply. The place that saved me, the place that called me mother. As they approached, Zara could see the changes they had made together, the fresh white paint on the shutters, the flower beds she had planted along the front path, the small corral where Reed kept his horses. It was no longer just a cabin in the wilderness, but a homestead, the beginning of something that might last for generations. Reed dismounted first, lifting Samuel down before helping Zara and Grace. The children, despite the long journey, perked up at the sight of home. Samuel running ahead with excited steps while Grace babbled happily in Zara's arms. As they crossed the threshold together, the familiar sense of pine and wood smoke welcoming them, Zara felt a sense of rightness, of completion. This place that had once known only grief had been reborn through love, through choice, through the everyday courage of beginning again. Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier, Reed said softly, his hand warm at the small of her back. Home, Zara agreed, leaning into his touch. Where we belong. Outside, the sun set behind the western mountains, casting long, golden light across the valley. Inside the cabin, a family gathered around their hearth, secure in the knowledge that whatever the frontier might bring, whatever joys or sorrows, triumphs or challenges, they would face it together. In the home they had built, in the life they had chosen, in the love they had found against all odds. And as night fell across the wilderness, the cabin that had once stood empty and silent embraced them all in its sturdy walls, mother, father, children, and the promise of more to come, just as it had always been meant to do.